All right, let's talk about colonialism, but maybe not in the way you're used to. We're going to look past the flags and the conquests and see it for what it really was, a meticulously planned economic playbook. We're going to break down its strategy, stage by stage. Let's get right into it.
When we think of empires, our minds usually jump to political domination, military might, that kind of thing. But what if that's only scratching the surface? Was it all just about power for power's sake?
Well, the argument we're exploring today is that it was something else entirely, a business plan, a cold, calculated strategy that evolved across three distinct stages, each one designed to maximize profit for the empire. And we're going to trace this playbook using one of the clearest case studies in history, British rule in India.
So, first things first, what are we actually talking about when we say colonialism? At its heart, it's a relationship of total subordination. The key thing to understand is that a colony's entire economy, its whole society, isn't guided by its own needs. It's fundamentally re-engineered to serve the interests of the distant metropolis, the imperial center. This relationship really has two fundamental features. First, that total subordination we just talked about. And second, the main goal, the whole point of the enterprise, economic exploitation. That just means siphoning off the colony's economic surplus, its wealth, its resources, its profits, and sending it all back home. This appropriation of surplus is the engine that drives the entire colonial project.
So how did this exploitation actually work on the ground? Well, it wasn't static. It changed over time. It evolved. We can actually break it down into three major stages, each with a different primary method of pulling out that wealth. This three-stage framework is going to be our roadmap for the rest of this explainer.
Okay, let's dive into stage one. This is the era of the famous East India Company. And this initial phase was, well, brutally straightforward. It was all about two things, monopoly and outright plunder.
The company had two really simple goals. First, crush all the competition. They fought wars to push out other European traders, and they used their growing political muscle to sideline Indian merchants. The goal was an absolute monopoly. And second, here's the kicker, why trade for money when you can just take it? By seizing state power, the company could directly grab tax revenues, essentially making the government's treasury their own personal bank account.
But here's what's so interesting. Look closely at what wasn't happening. At this stage, Britain had zero interest in changing Indian society. They were still exporting high-value Indian textiles back to Europe. The changes they made were minimal, just enough military and administrative tweaks to make collecting money easier. They were basically just skimming the cream off the top of the existing system. But then, everything changed. The Industrial Revolution started to boom back in Britain, creating this powerful new class of factory owners. And their needs were completely different from the East India Company's. They demanded that India serve a totally new purpose. And that kicks off stage two. The result was a complete 180-degree flip in India's economic role. India went from being a producer of high-value manufactured goods that it exported to being a source of cheap raw materials for Britain's factories and a captive market that was forced to buy Britain's finished goods, just a total economic reversal. Now, the crucial point here is that this new model couldn't just skim off the top like in stage one. Oh no. It required a radical top-to-bottom transformation of the entire colony. So-called free trade was used to open the floodgates for British products. The administration had to expand into every village to get raw materials out and sell goods back in. Even language and education were re-engineered, all to create a class of low-cost local clerks to run the whole system. So how do you justify this massive disruptive transformation? Well, you do it under a fantastic banner: development and modernization. This idea of a civilizing mission provided the perfect ideological cover for a complete economic rewiring of the colony, all in Britain's interest. Okay, let's move on to stage three, because the world changed again. By the 1860s, Britain was no longer the world's only industrial workshop. It suddenly had rivals, and this new global competition forced another major strategic shift. All of a sudden, other industrial powers were on the scene. You've got the USA, Germany, Japan. They're all competing for resources, for markets. And at the exact same time, new technologies like steamships and telegraphs were creating a truly unified and much more competitive global market. So what was Britain's response to all this new competition? It was defensive. With rivals popping up everywhere, it became absolutely critical to lock down its most valuable asset.
The strategy shifted from transformation to consolidation. It was time to tighten the screws and secure the massive investment that India had become.
You can actually see this new mindset personified by the viceroys of the era. The policies of guys like Lord Lytton and most famously Lord Curzon were all about bureaucratic efficiency, unquestioned authority, and absolute control. Any of those more liberal ideas from the previous stage started to fade away very quickly.
And this ideological shift was just stark. You know that talk from stage 2 about training Indians for eventual self-government? Yeah, that completely vanished. It was replaced by a hard-nosed, reactionary ideology that basically said colonial rule was permanent and it was essential for preserving order, which, of course, really meant preserving British economic interests. So, let's pull this all together. What does this complete economic playbook look like when we see it unfold over almost 200 years?
It all began with Stage 1, which was basically a direct smash and grab of plunder and monopoly. Then it evolved into Stage 2, a much more complex system of transforming India into a captive market and raw materials supplier for the Industrial Revolution. And it finally ended with Stage 3, this defensive move to consolidate, tightening political control to protect that valuable colonial asset from a whole new world of competitors.
So when you think of colonialism as an economic playbook, it gives you a powerful new lens to understand history. This blueprint of plunder, then market creation, and finally consolidation, it wasn't unique to India. So the final question to think about is this: where else can we see the same economic strategy shaping the modern world?